And here's a bit of what it said. We see many governments failing to prepare for the future on issues ranging from retirement and infrastructure to automation and worker retraining. As a result, society increasingly is turning to the private sector and asking that companies respond to broader societal challenges. This has been just published this week, so I thought if one of the most prominent investors on the globe is addressing this issue, there is no more relevant time for us to hold this session here today. There has been a dramatic change in the division of responsibility between the state and the private sector for the delivery of public goods in recent years over the entire world. It is even more apparent in the developing economies. On one side, we see the size of governments shrinking, and therefore states losing the capacity of providing global public goods on which they traditionally held monopoly. On the other side, what we see is different transnational actors getting more and more involved in providing global public goods, such as education, healthcare, telecommunications, and infrastructure. These actors are obviously large corporations, but also philanthropic entities and technology companies and startups providing innovative business models. So we're here today to discuss the implications of this massive shift for the public, for states, and for these private actors from the private sector. And to do so, we have 5 distinguished speakers that I will now introduce. On my far right, we have Tarek Elabbady. He's the Chief Technology Officer for Microsoft Emerging Markets Digital Transformation. Previously, he worked in the Windows Group and also as a research scientist at Medtronic. In the middle here, we have Sandhya Venkateswaran. She's Deputy Director, India at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She has previously served as Head of Advocacy at Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition and as a consultant for social policy at UNICEF. Next to me on my right is Hans Christian Hagman. He is the Chief Analyst at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Senior Advisor to the Swedish State Secretary. Can you hear me well? Okay, perfect. Sorry, so he's Senior Advisor to the Swedish State Secretary for Foreign Affairs and is Head of the Strategic Analysis at the Ministry. On my left, we have Sanjeev Bikhchandani. He's the founder and Executive Vice President of InfoEdge, which invests and runs portals such as Zomato and Naukri.com, India's leading job site. He's also a co-founder and trustee of Ashoka University. And on the far left is Mabel Broderick Okereke. She is the founder of Eto Echo, a social enterprise whose goal is to make education more accessible. Eto Echo is especially concerned with making it possible for women and children in Africa and other parts of the developing world to gain access to education. So we'll start by giving a few minutes to each of these speakers to give their opinion on the topic. And the lucky first one is Hans Christian.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Isabel. I'm honored to be able to contribute to what is now and soon becoming one of the major strategic forums here in Asia, to the Raisina dialogue. I come from Sweden, and it's a market economy with social and sustainable characteristics in a way. And I would like to start off with a little bit of a discussion on what role can and must the state have. And I would argue that it is first and foremost to promote and to protect the national interests. It is the citizens, it's the territorial integrity, it is the functionality of the state, and in many ways it's our way of life, whatever country you come from. And the state provides essentials, especially in the area of defense and security, both internal and external. Basic infrastructure. We in Sweden talk about education. Everything is free from daycare up to university studies. Healthcare, tax collection, and tax dissemination. But governments do not produce wealth. At best, it can promote growth, it can address wrongs and inequality, and distribute and contribute to the state in the form of distributing taxes. But good governments welcome competition, and they welcome a dynamic and private sector. Somebody has to bring in the money. And just from a historical context in Europe, before the state stepped up, it was the church who dominated the public goods, who contributed with essentially all health care, all care for the elderly, all education, all knowledge in the society. And the kings and feudal lords provided with legitimacy for the use of force. And of course, we've also had historical examples of major corporations having a role much bigger than just business. I'm thinking of the East India Company or the British South African Company with, to put it diplomatically, with mixed results. And today we have institutions such as the Gates Foundation or Warren Buffett, who are producing more aid and perhaps do more for global poverty reduction and health issues than most states and governments and many institutions. But the state cannot give up the monopoly on the use of force, tax management, rule-making, including the judiciary system, and the execution of powers. But almost everything else is a matter of political inclination and preferences. But it gets difficult when you get into the gray zone of security, for example, patrolling the streets. Must that be police, or is it okay with Securitas or a G4S or a security company? The same goes for military contractors. How much do you want to give up? How much of security you want to delegate to, for example, the Blackwaters, the Academy, the DynCorps of this world? The question is also when it comes to basic research, how much of that is the provision of the state, or should we be grateful when private enterprises and private donors contribute and do essentially what maybe the government should be doing for the long-term investment of countries? And then if you look at Europe, it's just a degree of where you draw the line. Postal services, railroads, roads, hospitals, education, prisons, care for the elderly. In Sweden, for example, we have a monopoly on the sale of alcohol. We think that's very important for the state. That's a red line. Private initiatives are not welcome there for the sake of health. The big debate in Sweden is the amount of profit private ventures in both the health sector and the education sector, how much profit they can take out as the state pays per patient or per student. So yes, we welcome private actors, but the question is how to guarantee quality and how much profit the taxpayers can stomach. The problem is what happens when things go wrong. If private companies go belly up, if they fail to deliver, whether it's banking systems or it's electricity or healthcare or transport, if you think of cyber security or cyber theft, when it becomes so serious that the state has to step in either to bail out or to protect. It is also difficult if a private actor for profit degrades global public goods, such as clean air or water, without compensating for it. And always when something is free, the degree of irrationality and inefficiency increases. And finally, knowledge is often defined as a global public good. But knowledge is data, and data is valuable. And who owns the data? In Europe, we're having a discussion with the right to be forgotten, the right of the individual there. Or is it the state who owns the data? The state previously had monopoly through intelligence services, data collection, statistical analysis, and so forth. Today, that is not the case. Or is it the company providing the service who owns the data? But the problem is that data will probably be way more important than the hardware. And software will rarely remain the exclusive entity for very long. You can send away an algorithm with a click of a key. And the computing power is today not any longer in the hands of private entities, or in public entities, but rather in the private entities. And today, who owns the data? It is not the state. It is the Walmart, It is the Alibaba. It is the Baidu. It is the Tencent. It is the PayPal. It is the Planets. It is the eBays and Googles who own the data. And today, China and the United States are competing for AI supremacy. And China is today leading the road when it comes to supercomputing. So what happens to data in the future, I think, is one of the key issues. Data is perhaps the most element of tomorrow's power. It's not just military power or the level of aid, which I think is a very key element of a state's capacity to project impact on others. But data is probably the most important factor in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans Christian. That was a very strong start. Now we'll move to Sanjeev. Please share your thoughts.
Thank you. I'd like to focus on the Indian experience over the last 20 or 30 years, on what's happened in this area of public goods being privatized, or allowing private entry, at least entry to private players in this area. So when I was starting my company in the early 90s, there were no mobile phones, and there was an 8-year waiting list to get a telephone connection, right? And telecommunication was a public good, right? But it wasn't very public because you couldn't get a telephone, right? Today, I think there are close to just under 1 billion mobile phones in India. You have hundreds of millions of people using them. So just with that example, and there are mixed bag actually in other areas, you know, the proliferation and success has not been so good. But if you look at, if I ask myself, you know, what is a public good, right? Or what are the characteristics of a public good? And at least my understanding, and I think the common understanding in India is that a public good belongs to the government, is run by the government, owned by the government. It's for the people. It's usually free or very cheap. But the reality is that, and it should be abundant to be available to the public. But the reality is that in a country of 1.2 billion or 1.3 billion people, you know, public goods are often very, very scarce if they are being run by the government, right? I mean, take the example of the 8-year waiting list. And the truth is that if governments really want to encourage efficiency, proliferation, expansion, growth, equity, at least several governments, successive governments in India have come to the conclusion that you can't do it without private participation, right? So if you look at sectors like telecom, airlines, power, healthcare, education, banking, insurance, while the state has not gone away, the state is still a player, private participation has come in and is welcome, and has been welcomed by the government. And, you know, what the telecom sector experience has proved, I think, is that with good regulation, good governance, and I'm saying good governance in spite of the various scams that have come out in the media in the past regarding telecom license providing, I think telephony is far, far more universal in India than it was when it was a government monopoly, right? So if you say that, you know, public goods, you know, when they're privatized, if they can deliver to the goals of, you know, quality, ubiquity, efficiency, and equity, right? Then you would say it's a successful policy, right? But that's not always been the case. Now, if you look at, so there are places where the government had a definite strategy, such as telecom and aviation. And in all these sectors where governments have allowed in private participation, right? There's always been a regulator, whether it is banking, or it is insurance, or it is telecom, or it is education, or even healthcare. There's been a regulator, but not all regulators have been equally good, right? So telecom is a success. Aviation is, you can also call it a success because, you know, flying by air today is far more accessible to many more Indians than it was 20 or 30 years ago. So I recall in my first job in the mid-80s, if I remember the price of an air ticket from Bombay to Delhi one way, it was about $100. right? That time a dollar was 10 rupees. Okay? Today, it's still, you can get an air ticket, at the right time, right airline, for about the same price. There has been, in that sense, in dollar terms, zero price inflation. And there's been massive expansion of capacity. Okay, power is a mixed bag. Healthcare is, I don't think, successful at all. So in places, government has not had a clear, good policy and has, frankly, receded and abdicated responsibility. So wherever there's a clear strategy, I think it can be done well. But there are enough areas of failure in India, or enough areas where it's been mixed results. And in each sector, it's a different reason and a specific reason. And sometimes they're state subjects, sometimes they're central subjects. So you really have to go case by case. And I think privatization or participation by the private sector is more or less inevitable in many, many areas, barring law and order, security, and places like that. It's inevitable. And the issue is, I think, to manage it well. And in India, at least 2 or 3 sectors seem to have managed it well, and 3 or 4 sectors, the experience has not been so good. And you have to go into each sector individually to understand the reasons why and see what the rectifications are.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Tarek, you're up.
Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Tarek Elabbady, representing the multinationals and technology today. I cannot basically echo more what Hans was saying about data. I think we live in a very unique time of digital transformation, overused term. But it's different than the last 20 years. I mean, the last 20 years we were promoting digitization, which is slightly different than what we mean today by digital transformation. For digitization, I think the race was on creating content in a digital form that has a value, and then we share it, monetize it, and so on. So, almost 20 years ago, I was promoting e-commerce and online practices, and the criticism for me was internet brings bad things in homes, because the only industry making money on internet at that time was the porn industry. But it did not stop. Thanks to the advertisements online and specifically opening channels for the small advertisers to be able to reach target markets, I think internet now, we cannot all live without it. Data is much cheaper to produce. Data can reach basically parts of the populations that we call them in the blind. They were underserved. They were not included in our systems. Now they are producers of data that can become of a value. So I would like to sell you on the concept of data is the currency of the future. And with that, let's figure out what multinationals can do. I think multinationals, specifically actually the one that I represent, needs to hand-walk governments. Because governments, while they are shrinking, or the perception they are shrinking in function, they're actually increasing in power, because they are the only one who has the power to aggregate data across ministries, across industries, and across borders sometimes. So, and intelligence only happen at the aggregation level. So keeping your data for yourself is not going to help. I think when you open it up for aggregation, you start to see really the insights that will make money eventually. So governments need to trust us. And the first phase for our engagement with governments, or partnership as I'd like to call it, with partnership with governments, is to really help them build the right infrastructure that offer them data sovereignty, data residency, but at the same time allow us to develop insights in a very large scale. We use the term big data analytics for it. But some of it actually happen at the edge of the technology, very close to the citizens. It has to happen in a very simple form, and it has to happen on very simple devices. And the term this year, I bet on it, is the term will be edge computing. You will hear it a lot in the next few months, in the next year. So you will hear a lot about edge computing. Eventually, we want to walk them into realizing what AI can bring to them. Artificial intelligence is another buzzword today, but they don't see the value for it. So ideally, actually, if we by hand walking them or building trust with governments, we really need to see how can we develop these services and tools that's based on AI in a way that it pays for itself, providing savings in the area of taxation, subsidy, surveillance, and bring basically cost savings to them in a way that it can pay for other investments in artificial intelligence. Because it's more than science fiction. It's actually things that can really make money for them immediately. And I think that's what the trust building is going to happen. Now let's shift gear and assume that actually we succeeded in convincing governments that they can build data assets that actually can live for years for their countries and can become of a monetizable value inside and outside. In fact, actually, we really need to shift gears and start talking about ecosystems that include, so the term inclusion comes next, include the citizens that actually in a very large amounts in the dark today, include them in our equation, so we don't see revulsion on the system like we're seeing in the globalization basically terms today. The inclusion can happen in a social way, and a lot of us actually see chat as a must-have today. Believe it or not, we see it even in the simplest form among the simplest people. Chat applications can really turn from something that we use it today just for filling our time to something that's very productive. It also can help us actually understand and pull information about these citizens and understand how they feel. So sentiment analysis, which is another artificial intelligence product, by the way, can really help us understand the changes, what it means to these citizens. And finally, actually, I think business models. And I think I will really make a call from today's session to invite economists to start to look at actually new way to engage with us. In fact, if there's a way to steer up our fellowships in this program to invite young economists to really participate in how data can change. When I see one of our sponsors, Uber, for example, which is a completely data-driven service today, succeeding in engaging basically citizens in a very humane and in a respectable way, but still basically while governments are embracing this part of the equation, they're fighting the service on the other side, which doesn't make any sense. So we really need to see economists designing marketplaces and changing basically the reward systems in a way that can reach these populations. And that's the doing good part of the equation. And I think to some extent we really need to understand that we are living in a good time powered by data. And I will stop here and hopefully we'll tackle more in the question part.
Thank you, Tarek. And now we'll move on to the philanthropic entities. Sandhya?
Thank you. So I want to just step back for a minute and look at what is it that we really mean by public goods, since we're talking about public goods. Economists tend to define public goods as goods and services that are non-excludable, from which you cannot exclude anybody, and those that don't reduce by increased consumption. So for example, clean air would be a public good, national defense would be a public good, diesel would not be a public good. Thank you. The point I'm trying to make is that very often we tend to confuse public goods with public services, and I think we need to make that distinction. And why is it important to make this distinction? Because public goods all too often have externalities, positive and negative. That means they impact a lot of people. It's not something that just impacts me as an individual. And in this context, markets are not always, I'm not saying never, they're not always best situated to deliver optimally. Collective action is required with a strong role by the government, and that is really why and where public goods are important. I want to locate this conversation in the context of health, because that is really what we work on. So within the health space, what are public goods? If we can include air, and just given what's happening in Delhi and the quality of Delhi's air, I would. So, clean air is a public good. Vector control is a public good. Immunization, and let's say TB treatment, because of the externalities, are public goods. And then issues like regulation, surveillance, standards, these are all public goods. The reason I'm giving examples is just to convey that public goods are very, very heterogeneous. The nature of public goods can be very different. So it's hard actually to have a conversation where we club them together and say, well, this is how public goods need to be dealt with, because given that they're so different, they need to be dealt differently as well. Coming back to health, India, unfortunately, has a huge unfinished agenda when it comes to public goods. I spoke of vector control. Those of us who are familiar with India, dengue rises every year. Malaria, 2016, 1 million people had malaria. Let's look at infectious diseases. TB, the data I saw, sad to say, India is at the bottom in terms of new tuberculosis TB cases. When we look at vaccination, our public vaccination system shows that full coverage of vaccines, only 65% of the population actually has full coverage. When we look at regulation and standards, all of us who are familiar with the Indian health system know that we're far below where we need to be. So there's a huge unfinished agenda, but sadly, it doesn't get enough attention. The question you would ask is, so what needs to be done? Before we get into what needs to be done, I just want to challenge for a minute the hypotheses of this discussion, where we said that the state is shrinking, and therefore, is there a need for private sector to come in? I was looking at data released by IMF, global data, and I think it covered about 135 countries, which showed that the role of the state in terms of spending as a percentage of GDP between 1960 and 2011 increased from 18% to 33%. So it's not shrinking. If we were to look at India, spending has been total, this is total spending, right? So in India, total state spending, central government and the state government, because India is a federal structure, as you probably know, has been around 26%, give or take, since the 1990s. So it may not have increased, but it hasn't shrunk. So therefore, the case for the private sector may not necessarily come from a shrinking state. There may still be a case, and that I would say will come from efficiencies, qualities, etc. Right? So what exactly, my last point, so where do we go from here? What exactly is the role of the private sector? Again, when we look at public goods, the way we define them, we say where, there isn't a one size fits all in terms of whether the private sector should or shouldn't play a role because of the distinction between public goods. But where excludability is low and social benefits are much larger, I would say we can break up public goods into two categories. Well, maybe there are different ways of looking at it, but we are looking at it from the metrics of measurability and breaking into two categories where measurability is low and social benefit is high. The state, the government needs to play a strong role both in financing as well as provision, and I'll come back to that. Where measurability is high, and when I say measurability, I mean measurability of outcome, and social benefit is high, there can be a case for private sector. So let's go back to our example. So for example, in the case of, let's say, TB treatment or vaccines, measurability is high. So the private sector can very easily come in and provide for these. But where measurability is low, for example, in terms of regulation or in terms of standards, it's very hard to be able to contract private providers. And that's where the government needs to play both the financing and the provisioning role. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Mabel.
Thank you. Thank you. First, I would like to thank the Observer Research Foundation for inviting me to appear on this panel. I'm honored to appear on this panel with my accomplished and esteemed fellow panelists. And I would also like to thank all of you for being here as well. My presentation is going to focus on gender and on education, and it will draw upon lessons learned during my doctoral research in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. During my doctorate, I spent a lot of time with grassroots women in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria who were focusing on peace-building efforts. There has been a long-running conflict of several decades in that area of Nigeria. According to the New York Times, there has been the equivalent of an Exxon Valdez oil spill every single year for 50 years. An Exxon Valdez oil spill every single year for 50 years. Just reflect on that. One of my panelists spoke about the degradation of public goods. This conflict is quite complex, and one of the reasons why it is so complex is because one of the drivers of the conflict is the fact that local communities feel that the oil companies are extracting billions of dollars from their ancestral lands, and they are degrading the environment. In addition to the oil spills, there have also been, Nigeria is one of the leaders in gas flaring, and gas flaring has been shown to cause many health issues and also lead to things such as acid rain. During my time in the field, I had the chance, or some might say the misfortune, to visit one of the oldest gas flares in Nigeria, and there's noise pollution. It's just very, very, very frightening, and people in the Niger Delta have to live with this on a daily basis. So the people are when we talk about public goods, the conflict is one where people are asking for the multinationals to stop with the degradation of public goods. They're also asking them to provide public goods. They would like access to assistance with health, access to education, scholarships, assistance with paved roads, and with provision of electricity. Insofar as the women that I interviewed are concerned, they would also like for the oil companies to engage in what we might in the West call, maybe gender sensitivity. So to consider them for jobs, and to also consider them as well to be inclusive of them for scholarships. The lessons that I learned that are applicable to the discussion that we're having in this panel were that an oil company that does engage in the provision of public goods and has a good relationship with local communities will not only engender goodwill on the part of the local community, but it actually helps their bottom line because it will be much easier for them to operate in a peaceful environment. In the Niger Delta, we call this, it's called the social license to operate. If you're seen as being a good neighbor, you will be in it will just be a much smoother ride for you. And one example of this concerns one of my case studies. In this case study, the oil community is literally almost adjacent to the oil installation. And local leaders described it as they're very, very close by, but it's like they're worlds away. The community had no running water, no electricity, huge pollution, and right across is a very, very modern oil installation. Oil workers are coming in on a helipad, fully electrified, beautiful installation. And the local community was like, well, why can't you just share some electricity with us? You're getting billions of dollars from extracting oil from our area. Why can't you just help us with electricity? That oil company had a lot of problems with the local community, and the women that I was studying, grassroots women, very, very brave, did not have the opportunity, many of them, to go to school. Some of them were not even able to write their own names. They were able to engage in nonviolent social protests that shut down oil production. So that's just one example of how it's really, really important to be a good neighbor. Nowadays, when we're talking about multinational companies, there has to be an element of CSR. There has to be an element of thinking about the local communities and how your work is impacting their lives. I'll leave it at there.
Thank you, Mabel. So we'll open up the floor for questions in a few minutes. And I'll start with well, do you have a question? Yes, sure, come.
Oh, okay. So I actually have a question to Mr. Dichandani. So you said, sir, that the telecom sector is one of the most successful ones in terms of the interface between public and private, in the public and private domain. But I'd like to know what metrics you use to come to this conclusion, because, sorry, so I'm just going to finish my question. I just have a couple of data points to it. That the telecom sector in India has one of the lowest ARPUs in the world, and you have an industry ridden with debt and limited infrastructure. And service delivery is quite poor. If you get into the nitty-gritties of the numbers, so 1.1 billion mobile phone connections, out of which there are only 350 million smartphones. When you combine that with the fact that the telecom policy says that 512 kbps is the minimum threshold for broadband, then it just comes out, and then you couple that with the fact that 6 Mbps is the average speed of internet connection in the country. So internet is quite slow, and the disbursement is quite poor, and you have spectrum allocation based on revenue maximization instead of welfare. So I'd just like to know in terms of what...
Could you even have this conversation 30 years ago? Okay. So 30 years ago, government monopoly, 8-year waiting list. Okay. Today, you have 1.1 billion phones. 5 years ago, even I didn't have a smartphone, right? This number will change over the next 2-3 years as smartphones get cheaper. If ARPU is low, I agree it's not so great for the companies, but it's great for the consumers, right? And if you talk about universal coverage, right, a low ARPU is essential. Now it is important to have a healthy industry, right? And the reason why it's not so healthy is because of competitive pricing practices. There seems to be over-competition. But industries go through such phases, right? A little bit of consolidation, and you will find that companies are getting viable, profitable. As India grows, people begin to use more and more data. ARPUs may also rise. But it will take a 5 to 7 year period.
Yeah, sir, but the whole problem, and this problem was faced with AT&T as well, was that telecom policy was based on universal basic service, which is actually a misnomer, because it just allows, because AT&T pushed for that policy to come through so that it would give it a monopoly. And as we all know, if there is a monopoly, even in traditional monopoly sectors like telecom, the consumer does suffer in the end.
So in India, the only monopoly in telecom has ever been that of the state, right? It's unlikely that you'll end up with a private sector monopoly here, given the fact that there are so many players. And the moment there's some consolidation, at least the rest should become all right. And let me tell you, when there was a state monopoly, and you're absolutely right about monopolies, including state monopolies, that service was poor, service was restricted. You had to pay speed money to get a phone if you wanted it faster than 8 years, right? So I'm not sure that it's good service, and it certainly wasn't universal.
But so the spectrum allocation, if you look at it even now, because of that, we still have poor service. So there is no incentive. international
we no.
buy spectrum in places where they have a minimal amount of customers. That's why if I'm a Vodafone customer.
So the markets will not solve all problems, right? And where markets don't solve problems, maybe you need some state intervention, right? Now, this could come in the form of incentives. It could come in the form of state doing it directly. But the move from, I don't know how many telephone connections there were in 1995 when before mobile phones came into India, but it could not have been more than 10, 20 million, right?
Don't you think so? There should be a shift from an emphasis on quantitative metrics rather than from quantitative metrics to qualitative metrics, so the quality of service.
So the challenge of a democracy where there are 1.3 billion people, where a large number are poor, I think any government is going to first say, let everybody access it, right? It cannot be that, hey, let's keep 100 million people but give high quality service and charge high prices, right? And I think that is embedded into the DNA of India, that ultimately governments will decide on the basis of where the voters are. And I don't think that is going to change. And frankly, I think it's all right.
I wanted to get back also on something that Tarek has said, as data is the currency of the future, and that states have the power in the aggregation of the data. So maybe Hans Christian, if you want to react to that.
I think definitely that states should be part of the equation. States have the legitimacy to coordinate, but also internationally. But again, it is very different from country to country today. We do not have global standards when it comes to cyber security, for example, or how we treat data. And I think that is a discussion we need very, very soon, just as we need a discussion on artificial intelligence before it has gone too long. Who invests in this technology? How do we control it so it's used for good and not for the bad? So I think that was.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, you can turn on the microphone right next to you.
Okay. So I just kind of in response to the comments about government and data, one of the things that you mentioned was that government inefficiency has essentially led to more of a dominance from the private sector. And then with kind of the rise of things like blockchain, you're seeing, essentially blockchain provides the ability for people to have more transparency and fewer gatekeepers in person-to-person interaction. And so much of what government does, I think by the large percentage of the public, is probably viewed as incredibly inefficient from many perspectives. And I think there are also things that corporations do that are also inefficient, or they act as gatekeepers in places where they aren't necessary. So one of the things that I'm, I think, curious about is kind of this interaction between the shift in decentralization, but also the shift in public trust. So one of the things that we're seeing in the US that became very apparent in the most recent election is that 60% of millennials don't believe in capitalism. And that's a huge, that is a huge, very foundational shift for a country, especially one as powerful as the United States. And so I think this is a very, interesting confluence of factors and kind of a very pivotal time. So I was just curious, any of you obviously are welcome to respond, but I think Hans and Tarek.
Thank you very much. I think that the public trust issue is incredibly important. My God, this is the very foundation of democracy, is trust. And if we squander that in some shape or form, for whatever reason, that's extremely serious. But I'd like to say, the government's role is very important when it comes to standard setting. We heard here from Mabel on the corporate social responsibility element. We in Sweden, we talk a lot about sustainability and equality. So all standards, it may be a high standard by international levels, but it is a standard which we are prepared to pay for. And I think that when it comes to blockchain, governments should enable, facilitate for the most rational, efficient elements, but there are certain red lines where we do not want to give up, because that's what taxpayers demand of the state to provide certain goods and services. But I think the public trust, that really, really concerns me. And all suggestions on how that could be strengthened so that government, at least, is seen as transparent, honest, good, and I mean, it's enough with one small little corruption scandal or whatever scale to do a lot of damage, but also for government to explain to the public that, hey, we need to do this together. And I think it's only when government is truly transparent and honest and non-corrupt that it can either regain the trust or maintain a degree of trust. But it's really difficult. I hope you have any better solution there from Microsoft.
Well, I'm pleased that the question came from the blockchain side, not from the newsfeed side, because I was expecting it to come actually with all the hoopla about false news and the campaigns of attacks and whatever. So I think this is a very good question. I congratulate you on it. Blockchain as a technology is just a mean for exchange of data. I wouldn't put a lot of emphasis on the blockchain as it is, because there's other means that are coming out much faster, and it may offer actually more efficient ways to do things. So it's a tactic, not that. But when I said hand-walking governments, it's actually not questioning any bad intentions from the governments in this case, because I think there's a lot of education. And the trust is going to come when the governments actually understand their own data and understand what's valuable, what's not valuable, what's sensitive, what's not sensitive. It's going to take time, and then when they realize that, they will start to really look for the means to use the data. So let's say, let's take the blockchain and specifically, basically, try to build a case here. Imagine actually ministries' data is exchanged over blockchain. Okay. Which means that any citizen who interact with or have a transaction with any of the government agencies, it's replicated across all government agencies. And this is pretty much basically an ease of use requirements. So I don't need to really authenticate myself and fill forms every time I interact with a government agency. This thing is replicated, everybody knows everything about me, and when I sell a piece of land or I renew my license, it's everything, it's known, okay? That's an ease of use. It's a lot of savings for the government and a lot of efficiency building for them, and they will realize it and they will start to embrace it from that angle only. And then you start to build on top of it an identity management system where it's actually like India basically embracing digital identity. And if you anchor this on this system, then it's becoming actually a seamless experience for the citizens, so they're very satisfied, and this is the good part of the story, where your experience with government agencies becomes improving, and all of a sudden there's a trust in the building between the citizens and their governments, because they see how basically the trust is developing in the system. So I think it's a gradual thing, but if you come and actually hit it as a blockchain, which is a very strange term, and there's a lot of ignorance on the other side, they will fear it, and they will start to really walk away from it. But there is good into it, but it has to be done in a hand-walking or a multiple phases, not a shocking of the system. I hope that addresses your concern. Similar things about the news, by the way. You can say the same exact thing about the news. You talk to millennials today, and my daughter was one of them. She graduated from the same school that Hillary Clinton came out. She was really upset about actually the elections and all the fiasco that happens with the media at that time. And if you ask the millennials whether they use the regular means of media today, they say no. We have our own ways to really get the information, and we get it actually much faster than you did, and Mom. So I think to some extent it's also applied to the media for that sake. You are.
Thank you. Yes.
So, good afternoon. My name is Tirthanka Goyal. So, before the question, put my background in the question. I was working with the French government selling the nuclear reactors to the government of India. So I quitted them. So I've been working between France, Germany, UK, and India on the transfer of technology to India. So technology is very important point for us. And I found in Europe, every country has a very specific technology for which they are very advanced. So where there in Paris, we are comparing Indian side as well as the EU side, and I hate this question of this technology side making an equivalent of India to either France or Germany or US. I tell them, you know, they are very far ahead of us, and we are living in a very unequal world where Indian people are facing a lot of problems. There's no support from the government in terms of the health, education, and any other sector. So I started the one venture in India. It's a very volunteer side. I said a lot of students are coming to Paris. So I started with a chain that they are unemployed. So whosoever gets a first job, you know, they give a job to the next person, help them to get a next person. Now this mission has now crossed more than 100 people. And that's why I will be discussing with Sanjeev. So my question is to two panelists here, one madam from the Melinda Foundation and one non-Indian, whosoever wants to take this question. So keeping in mind the inequality and keeping in mind the problems which are there in India, and keeping in mind the technology for all these Western countries are having. So what do you think, I mean, what could be the best way for this transfer of technology to India in the current scenario, whether in the healthcare or any other sector?
Yeah, sorry. So you said what is the best way for transfer of technology?
The new technology, emerging technologies,
right,
like, you know, the wind or power or in the smart city or any sector,
right,
railways. So all these European countries, they are sitting on the huge technologies, right? So they are trying to do the transfer of technology to India, which are not suitable, but in India due to a little bit expensive. So like in your case.
So, you know, again, I would bring your question back in the context of this conversation, which is where we are looking at, let's say, public goods. I mean, transfer of technology can happen for various things at various levels, right? Where there is transfer of technology happening for a private good, it is really up to a particular entrepreneur, industry, etc. And I would not comment on that. But I'm assuming that your question, because you talked about inequities, so here we will look at it from the point of view of technologies for use of a public good, right? There obviously the main factor to look at would be what would be the access across the population of this technology, or what would be the social impact or the social benefit of this technology, right? To the extent that we have a high social benefit, it's perhaps advisable to look at such transfer of technologies. And again, I must qualify, I say this from the perspective of public goods, because otherwise there are many other arguments, and I'm not responding to that. Yeah.
I'll make a comment on this, because I think that the tech transfer concept is being disrupted as we speak. When you say technology, it is, again, very heavy on data. Whether you are developing an Internet of Things, basically, system, or you're developing a clinical trial with analytics on top of it, it's all about basically the portion of the value that sits in the data side is very big. What that means is that the cycle of producing this technology is very fast. I work for a technology company for 20 plus years now, and I saw the cycle shrinking from 3.5 years to 3.5 hours. We release a service, an update for the service every day, multiple times. So talking about technology transfer, it has to be much faster. So the best idea for technology transfer is to release things in a beta form or an alpha form, and see the data, collect the data that tells you how the perception of this technology is being developed, and then modify it. So that's on the mechanism side. But I want to address basically the diversity point and the education side of things as well, because technology can be a mean of skilling. And I like to introduce the term skilling over education, because we really need to think in an exponential, out-of-the-box way to educate the major segments of the population who for years has been in the blind. We have a chance now to connect with them. We have a chance to skill them on new things to do. And if you're gonna tech transfer something for the public good, you right away need to figure out how to skill the recipients in a fast way using the same mean of technology. So that guarantees that your tech transfer will be acceptable on the other end.
Thank you. We had one question here.
Hello? Does this work? Ann Bowser from the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I've watched 2 administrations now talk about open data and the value of open data to increasing public trust, transparency, efficiency, research, and then later economic competitiveness. So my questions are, with themes like the value of aggregation being really important in this panel, and also panelists beginning to discuss the concept of data literacy and how much the public really knows about what's happening with their information and is able to control and contend with their information, who really benefits from open data?
Who would like to?
I can say that one of the constituencies that can benefit from open data are citizens. And you know, in the United States, we kind of, I think sometimes take for granted how easy it is to get access to data. There's a data.gov portal, we have FOIA, but in other countries, it's really not as easy to access data. For instance, in the Niger Delta region, there have been NGOs that have been asking the multinationals. There's something called the Publish What You Pay initiative. I believe that open data, and from what I've seen, open data and more transparency, not only on the part of governments, but also on the part of multinationals, can actually help to further democracy. Because an informed citizenry is better able to make choices. And so I think that democracy can benefit from it, and also citizens can benefit from it.
I would like to label myself data at the end, but I think to some extent everybody benefits from open data, but it's not a slam dunk. I mean, it's a very utopia kind of view of things. Any player will embrace open data, but when it comes to their own data, they will start to question the reason for pushing it out. So I think this is where economists are needed, because when you start to really creating a marketplace with a reward system and incentives for people to share data, and there will be a benefit for everybody and guarantees that the value will be exchanged in this case, maybe over blockchain or whatever. But I think to some extent that's what my call for an economist's minds to come and actually figure out in this new space of data exchanges. I mean, one of the things that I promote is that banks start to get into building data exchanges, because that's what the currency, if we really believe it's going to be the currency of the future, then banks needs to figure out what role they need to play in.
Just a little addition, but it also depends on whose data it is. If I own my own data, maybe I should be putting a price on that data, however small it is. Like if I've written a song and it's been played on the radio 20 years later, well, you get a little cut from that. I think how to put a price on that, I think is really, really difficult, but I think that's maybe something in the future, that our data is valuable, the individual's data is valuable. Please use it, but only with permission and only at a cost, however small it is.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, this one. Oh, okay. Okay, thank you very much. My name is Nadine Goderhardt. I'm with the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And, well, I probably more have a comment or want to share my worries, because there's one country that is probably not really mentioned here, and that is China. And I'm working on China a lot. Sort of the new government that we see under Xi Jinping, I mean, he really said that providing a society with digitalization, with all the access that is possible, is also a public good. So, I mean, we see this now that China also tries to export these kind of public goods. That doesn't mean only digital payment services or, I don't know, the idea of sharing bikes or something like that, but also, and Hans Christian also mentioned this, and this is artificial intelligence in Huawei mobile phones. We also have augmented reality that is much more developed in China with Baidu. Then, of course, the quantum technology, not only which is I mean, if you combine all these things into one, then you have a really big challenge. So this is probably also a question. I mean, how can we deal with this? I mean, when we talk about regulation, we talk about maybe the European Union, and we are, I think, quite successful in some regards. But still, how can we push this on the global level? How can we work together with these countries that are usually not part of the debate when we talk about this? Thank you.
Just so you all know that Germany is at the very forefront when it comes to discussing China today, and I would just like to echo that. I think this is a super important issue. Everything on how China uses, if they have the most data and most access, if the Chinese state has most access to data, and it's not back doors from Google to the NSA, it's front doors. And they have new intelligence laws, which literally makes every Chinese citizen and company obligated to provide intelligence. And I think that's is quite public information. And they have the supercomputing power and the state-owned enterprises, and how they combine this and how that has an impact on individuals, social credit systems, for example, which I think is both fascinating and frightening. But especially when it comes to international competition, if they can add data and use data in a way which we do not want to use data or cannot use data, that could be both a formidable challenge for us, and also have to question maybe how we use data and so forth. But really, really difficult. But that is the odd example where they have the mass and the knowledge and the money to do something more. And I think that if we have this discussion in 5 years' time, we will be wiser and say that, wow. Or we'll say that, okay, 1 + 1 + 1 = 2 because of other elements.
Can I make one comment before we? I mean, I would like to leave with an optimistic view. China and India has always been viewed as competitors because of their power as the populations. I would say that China used more of the population in the last 15 years to make themselves basically an economic power. With the shift, with the digital transformation that's happening and the more emphasis on the inclusion of the populations in India here, I view that India will be rising in economic power much faster in the next few years. And I think China will look at that very carefully, given the fact that it's an aging population, looking for a better way of using their population. And I will see a shift in their policies on that end as well. So that's the optimistic view of things.
Thank you.
I'm James Crabtree from the Lee Kuan Yew School. It relates actually to your question in a way. I mean, it strikes me we're interested in this topic because we're worried that the provision of global public goods is inadequate and potentially declining, partly because the nature of the challenges are increasing as the world becomes more global, but also as the United States, as the predominant provider of global public goods retreats, that we expect that other countries will not step in to fill the gaps. So a sort of simpler question than the one that was just asked. In your own particular areas, do you anticipate that China will begin to provide more of the public goods that you are interested in, whether it's cybersecurity and AI or healthcare and education? And relatedly, if not, what can be done with the international financial institutions to plug this gap? How can they coordinate better? And should, for instance, the idea floating around and being considered by the G20 Eminent Persons Group, which is reporting in October, that the World Bank should be refocused only on global public goods and not in supporting programs in individual nations? And would you support that as an idea if you don't expect that a country like China or India will fill the gap that the US is leaving?
Anyone wants to?
Well, I don't believe in the stick policy. I really like to see more carrots in the incenting China China in general is an economic power. Don't forget that. And if their trade gets affected by any of these malfunctions of the or maluse of the infrastructure, I think they will be impacted and they will be the first to respond. I really don't have a view. It's always nice to see basically international organizations engaged as a way to provide carrots rather than basically enforcing with a stick. So that's how I see it. I really think that China is a very good on trade, and it's a proposition that we need to develop as a community, and you will see them responding. That's how I see it.
I think it's an excellent question. Will China begin to provide more public goods? And I definitely think it is, that they will. Just look at intellectual property. Today, China has more patent applications than the EU, Japan, and the United States together. In time, they will have an interest also in protecting their own investments, which are huge in the high-tech field. When you look at green tech, for example, what they can do in green tech will be spectacular if they get it right and if they have the size. Just look at clean air. If they can show examples and use that, that will be a public good if they can get it right. And it may not be the most democratic of means as we define it, but if they can get it right, it will have a huge impact. The self-driving cars, the same. Synthetic biology, education. When they become a major education player, they will be providing a global good. But this is a double-edged sword. I think we need to be very open about this, but it's definitely not just negative. There are a lot of very, very positive, and if China can be on board, it can be a formidable force on sustainability, for example. Substantial. Thank you.
My name is Karthikeya Singh, and I'm with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS in Washington, D.C. Thank you all for your presentations. I'm going to try and lift it out of data as much as I love data, and direct this question at a more meta level around the role of non-government institutions, so in this case, private sector and philanthropy, to fill the void or augment or assist where government services aren't being met. And this one, I want to direct to Ms. Venkateswaran or perhaps Mabel regarding the role of philanthropy, which we're hearing increasingly, particularly in the United States, as filling the void at the local level. You know, you're talking about high-level interventions on education and healthcare and climate, which is something that's really the philanthropy community has really stepped up in the United States. But at a more local level, the role of philanthropy and governance structures around how philanthropy might intervene at the very local level to assist in what communities need, where government is not able to, for whatever reasons, budget cuts, et cetera, able to fill the void. Like, how do philanthropies make that decision? And is there an architecture that's needed to inform that process or to govern it and to provide the best public good that communities actually need? Thanks.
So in many ways that is already happening. So I would go back to what I said earlier. I think the responsibility would still be of the state, but philanthropy would, or philanthropic organizations would have a strong role to play in terms of filling the gaps in provision. So let me take a few examples. Again, I'm sorry, I will speak from the health context, right? So India has a large vaccination program, but typically the last mile, in fact, why just vaccines? Anything, the last mile is always a big challenge. That's where civil society organizations or other philanthropic organizations can play a fairly constructive role in identifying what are the kind of mechanisms to reach the last mile. So wherever government doesn't have the capacity, the expertise, the sensitivity, if I can call it that, these organizations can play a big role. But the challenge is that the entire responsibility cannot be abrogated to them, because in themselves, no matter how large they may be, philanthropic organizations are still a drop in the ocean. They are very small. I mean, you said there are many in the US. Indeed, there are. There are many here as well, of different sizes and forms. But they can never replace the role of the state. They can partner with the state. I'm from the Gates Foundation, so we're a philanthropic organization. We're very large. But not for a second do we pretend that we can actually do the job of the government. What we do is where we see that things are falling through the cracks, we try and identify why things are falling through the cracks and then try and support that through coming up with innovative solutions, which could be in the form of there is missing data, there is a need for technology, just capacities being built, etc. Or innovative mechanisms, right? For example, in the health space, quite apart from what the government supplies, the behaviors of people are key to your health outcomes. So there is a strong body of work which works with communities to change behaviors. Traditionally, that has been done either through mass media or through interpersonal communication. Increasingly, there is technology that is intervening. Technology is being used to do that. And then organizations such as ours can contribute enormously in trying to identify the role of technology in something like that.
I think that philanthropic institutions can play a very large role, a very pivotal role, and I will use examples from Nigeria, specifically the Niger Delta. Some suggestions that I would have for creating an architecture for this to be done very effectively, or in a more effective manner, is number one, consult with local communities. In the Niger Delta, there are grassroots women activists. There are women who are working day in and day out. One woman said to me that, he who wears the shoes knows how it fits. So they have a lot of knowledge that they can share, and they care deeply about their communities. Have consultations with them. Number two, empower people so that they can empower themselves and pay it forward and help other people. How can that be done? I personally believe that education is one of a very, very powerful way to do this in the Niger Delta scenario. In order to really advance in Nigerian society and to move from poverty to middle class, or to become involved in a significant manner in the political life of a community, it's very necessary to have an education. So something such as providing scholarships, or organizing training sessions, or disseminating materials, that can really help a lot to empower people. Number three, be transparent. It can be as simple as sending out information about what you're doing over social media, or having a blog, just documenting what you're doing, letting people know what's going on. That can also help with the architecture of the delivery of these types of services. And finally, number four, please always think about gender. Engaging in gender mainstreaming can really, really have, I cannot understate how significantly that can change the society for the better. In the Niger Delta region, women are not allowed to own land, and it's an agricultural environment. For the majority of the communities, land is disseminated within the communities, it's owned communally, and you're not allowed to have a share of the agricultural land unless you're married or you're a male. So in such an environment, education is crucial. I met one woman who is now a very senior figure in a very senior figure in the Niger Delta government, who she talked about this, and she said, yes, I wasn't allowed to own land, so I went to school, I went to law school, and now I can buy my own property. And that's radical. That can completely change a society. So doing something as simple as saying, okay, I'm going to offer scholarships, and 50% of them must go to women. It must be equally split between men and women, can hugely change a society.
Yeah, have a few minutes. So I'm afraid we're almost out of time, but we'll have one last intervention from Tarek.
I want to give you an answer. No, I think there's ways of using technology again with data, bring you back to data, to build what I call digital railways. Okay, and China, by the way, is investing heavily in Africa and other places on physical railways. What I propose is that the NGOs or the non-profit organizations can be tied with a digital form to create a network effect, and that's where you get the scale that will probably provide interest from an economic perspective, and then the cycle goes on. And one by themselves cannot scale, but if you tie them together and you start to have a customer-to-customer effect, then you start to see the real benefits.
Well, thank you very much, distinguished speakers and participants, for this session. It was a very full discussion. I'm sure we would have a lot more to say. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the Raisina dialogue today.